Well, you're very welcome today. Today we're going to have a look at the sexual orientation ground under the Equality Bill. So I thought if we had a look at two movies, Brokeback Mountain and Priscilla, Queen of the Desert. And maybe to kick off, if we have a quick preview of Brokeback Mountain to see what that was all about.
Directed by Ang Lee, Brokeback Mountain is set in rural Wyoming in 1963. Working as shepherds on a remote mountain, the film tells the story of two cowboys, Jack and Ennis, whose friendship over the course of a summer develops into a deep love for one another. Leaving the mountain, the men separate and continue their lives with their partners Alma and Lorene. Ennis marries Alma while Jack and Lorene have a son together. But when a postcard arrives inviting Ennis to meet with Jack again, Alma becomes suspicious of the men's relationship. On their fishing trip, Ennis and Jack renew their bond despite their fear of discovery and what that will mean. They dream about being together, but they realise that their relationship must remain a secret. Eventually, years later, Ennis discovers that Jack has passed away. Heartbroken, he is full of regret that he could never be with the one person that he truly loved.
Well, maybe before we get into that, if we just kind of recap on what the sexual orientation ground is, if anybody would like to.
It's equal status whether you're heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual or transgender.
Okay. And what do people think of that in relation to the movie then?
It was a very disturbing movie. Right. Because they were not satisfied in any relationship they had. And maybe it was in the 63, it was in 1963, it was the 60s, and people wouldn't accept this gay's relationship, you know. And it was sad because they were married and they were not happy in that. They couldn't keep their wives happy, even though they lived a life to show society. And they themselves were never together. Always when they were upset, they used to come running towards each other, you know. And it was sad, actually, the movie, that you can't do things in the open. Yeah. And
what I thought was remarkable about it as well was like it's based in 1963 to 1983, like that's a 20-year gap. And it's all about this rural homophobia and this regret and how homosexuality is swept under the rug. But even in that pivotal time was the gay liberation movement, while they don't mention it at all in the film. And I thought that was really interesting as well. Like even the word gay is never said in the film. The word queer is said once, and otherwise it's just not actually referred to. People know what they're talking about, but they never actually say it. And that just shows the rural homophobia as well, like how it's the word that couldn't even be spoken. It's the ultimate taboo. Yeah.
But also during the movie, Ennis, played by Heath Ledger, says, "You know, I'm not queer," and then Jake Gyllenhaal, who plays Jack, yeah, he says, "Either am I." So they're not even admitting to themselves that they're gay.
I suppose you think about it, they can't. I mean, look what happened to Jack's character in the end, you know? And what would you think about that in terms of, I know we've spoken about it being 1963, but versus, that was the States in 1963. What about Ireland today?
It's a bit funny because obviously we've come a long way, and homosexuality was legalized here in 1993. But still, I have a few friends who've been attacked for being gay. And so the same problems are still there. We have come a long way, but there's still that underlying homophobia, especially in rural Ireland, I think. And it's much the same as in the film. I think it's so much more prevalent in rural Ireland. Maybe that's because I grew up as gay in rural Ireland, but maybe it's my perspective, because you always, when you're gay in rural Ireland, you always have this idea of when you go to the city, it's almost no, I don't know any gay people who grew up in the country and wanted to stay in the country, if that makes any sense. Because it's always this, Dublin was always this mecca of understanding and open-mindedness.
But would it not be the fact, Dave, because you come from the country, that there's a certain anonymity up in Dublin for you, yeah. Whereas if you came from the Dublin area, you know, you mightn't have that privilege if you're living in a estate in Dublin, yeah. Or living in the centre of the city and you're known, you know. Yeah. I think it's an attitude, really, isn't it, that's prevalent in a lot of communities.
So certainly in terms of the amount of depression that's being talked about, and a lot of it in the media lately as well. I think you have to look at, while I do understand, we've had this discussion before, that with certain people there is a genetic predisposition to people being depressed, but there are many reasons for being depressed. For instance, it could be somebody who sexually abused a child. There are many different reasons for it. Bullied, many things. But one thing that isn't often spoken about, particularly boys, is maybe it's a sexuality thing. So while these people present as being depressed, you have to ask yourself, particularly if there isn't a history of it in the family, what are they depressing, you know, and let's take the lid off it and have a look at it. And this is one of the things that should be spoken about. So there are a lot of, what will I say, there are many others, and I think certainly in terms of sexuality, and particularly, you know, gay, lesbian, like, it's always been there. So we have to ask, you know, where was it before that it's just beginning to emerge now? So I think a lot of the people who had these issues either stayed single, or else they went into marriage, some of them, and some of them went into priesthood, certainly in Ireland. That's where they all are. They're in our society, but they're hidden.
They were always here, because I think that as well. I'd say the statistics were always the same, it's just it was well hidden. But there are even statistics for, like, it's interesting what you said earlier, like, for men under 25, or for males under 25, I should say, Ireland has the highest suicide rate in all of the EU. And as well, I think it's either between 3 or 5, it depends on where the statistic is. In Ireland, you're either 3 or 5 times more likely to kill yourself if you're a gay teen than you are a straight teen.
I was listening to the radio the other day. It was a morning show, and they were talking about the way words used to describe gay people are becoming a lot more acceptable. They shouldn't, but they are. Like, and I was very interested in it, and I listened to the whole show. And the next day on the Dart, I heard a young guy, he must have been about 13 or 14, say something, and I just went, it was horrible. You know, like they say that people who use the words fag and queer and all that don't mean any offence to gay people, but I think it's a big offence to anybody that's gay if you use words like that.
I wonder how, I don't know who you saw saying that word, how old they were.
It was
did
a
they
school
understand
person.
the words? Yeah. I mean, like, the context of stuff is so important sometimes.
But
like
those words seem to be becoming acceptable just to describe things like, oh, he's annoying, he's a fag, or, you know, stay away from him.
That's always, I went to an all-boys school, and there was nothing worse than being gay. Like, that's what was used as like a bargaining kind of insult between people.
But are they referring to a person who's gay?
No, they were referring to someone who didn't want to play football, or the guy who wanted to sit up the front of the class. So I know the context of the word is terrible, and can be very hurtful. But I think sometimes a young child will say something, they don't know the gravitas behind the word.
Yeah, this is like a huge problem in Hollywood. Like what I was saying as well, it's any gay character usually ends up dead at the end of it, or else severely unhappy. Like, they did a poll of the last 20 years, and the big Oscar winners that were gay, and it's Philadelphia, Beginners, Boys Don't Cry, Brokeback Mountain, Milk. The character dies at the end, and the character, it's either suicide, it's AIDS, or it's murdered by homophobes. Yeah, there's always those 3 that keep popping up again and again, and that's why the kids are all right. We're so refreshing how the character survived, even nonetheless had a happy enough ending. But yeah.
For me, with the film, what I found very interesting was, like, it shows the wives, the effect on the whole family, that it's not just the 2 men involved, that their lives are ruined pretty much because they're being made to keep up this facade. It's also the wives. You can see even when the wife is pregnant and she's married the guy from the store, the anger when she's gone on about, I had tied this note to your fishing, and never, and because she obviously did love him, and it's that anger that she feels she was, lied to, and they kept it between, and that he wouldn't admit then, but he couldn't, because you can see from him it's the absolute fear when he's explaining that what his father brought him to show what's done to people that are seen to be gay, and that kind of torture and death. So he's thinking, well, no matter what, I'm not going to admit that. And for me, it brought back conversations over the last 10 years that I've had within Ireland about, for me, I'm thinking it's still, no matter how much, people are like, there's so much LGBT information. What I feel, well, things are changing, but there is still loads within homes isn't changing, and to do with different generations, and that I would still, a lot of people from, like, a generation behind me who would say, there's this fear of, well, if we expose too much, it's going to be made gay, and then you get into the whole nurture against nature. And, oh, well, it's often like in the family, or, you know, people say between families, well, he's gay because, you know, his mother was, you know, the one that wore the pants, or she was very glamorous, you know, so it's like, all right, so that's why they made them gay. Or people, you know, and I can't believe, like, now you're thinking, people still say, like, so you're going to make, so it's not the way you're born, it's not what you feel, it's you'll be made gay. So if you can make people move boys or girls through this way of life, avoid all the gay traps, oh, then we'll all be fine, you know. And
Do you think it's the same everywhere, or do you think Ireland is more closed to people?
I think because of the Catholic religion in Ireland, we certainly have a certain perspective on it, and I'd say, you know, it's always easy for me to judge against Italy because they would be so religious as well. That it would be very similar in Italy. But then again, you know, in France now they are pretty. It's something can be talked about because the riots going on and the street marches about the whole civil status.
I always remember being in Australia when I was 19, and the Mardi Gras was incredible. Yeah. Absolutely amazing, and everybody was having fun. I know there was probably a few, you know, fights or whatever. Like not everybody was having fun, but like it was a big celebration. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Tom. I'm not a defender of the Catholic Church, but I think it's not just the Catholic Church. If you think about, you know, the number of religions in America, in West America, they are so homophobic. You know.
Well, religion probably. I mean, I don't know.
Well, this is it,
and
you know, and the Muslim religion. You know, they it's just.
No, but even the Hindu, like, because in India it's all closed, it's all under the carpet. They're not even accepting it, even the government, you know. So it's very difficult for gays and lesbians to come out and live a good life. So when I saw this movie, it was just like that, the way they can't breathe, you know.
And that brings us, speaking of rural outback, it brings us very nicely into our next movie. So we might have a quick look at a snapshot of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert, if that's okay.
The Adventures of Priscilla, Queen of the Desert is an Australian road movie with a difference. Tick, better known as Mitzi, is worried what his young son will think when he finds out he's a drag queen. He and his fellow queens Bernadette and Felicia are about to travel across country to perform at an event in Alice Springs on their lavender bus Priscilla. The trio set off, but disaster strikes when the bus breaks down, leading to some impromptu performance. Gallant mechanic Bob, captivated by Bernadette, joins the trio on the road, and although they encounter intolerance and homophobia, they also experience friendship and not a little fun. Finally, they arrive at their destination with Mitzi's son completely accepting his father. The girls perform their flamboyant routine to wild applause, and we have a happy ending to what has been a fabulous journey.
A very different movie. Well, what did you
colourful
think?
movie.
Wasn't it? Yeah. So speaking of your Mardi Gras, that kind of...
Yeah, it's an unusual one as well because, again, it relates back to Brokeback Mountain, is that it is these people trying to get through life and trying to get through life a certain way. But obviously they're more out in the open about it, but there's still that rural homophobia, going back to that again, that stopped them. Like you have the guys who spray paint their bus. Yeah.
But David, I have to say something. One of the scenes that I really remember is when they met the Aboriginals. Yeah. And they seemed to... Yeah, the Aboriginals were okay with these people, these colourful, flamboyant people, and I just thought they had a connection. Yeah.
Well, you have to remember...
I mean, they're rural. Of all the people in Australia, they would be the most rural, wouldn't they?
Yeah, of course, but the Aboriginals are also on the fringes as well, funny enough. So you have this kind of bonding over, like... these people who aren't that accepted. Yeah.
And the other thing, I don't know about the Aboriginals specifically, but certainly in terms of a lot of indigenous tribes, certainly in the States and that, it would have been, you know, if you had a child who was gay, that child would have been revered because the child was seen spiritually to sit between the realms of the male and the female and was able to encompass both realms easily. So that child would also be chosen when it grew up to be the one who would be the security person at night time to guard. It was the safe bet because a man could be tempted by a woman or whatever the case may be, whereas you could put this person on and this person would be able to what will I say, guard the camp more. But if we spoke earlier on about, I know previously about marriage and people who are very brave to leave a marriage. Do you think people who are gay or transgender, in terms of this movie, do you think they're brave?
I do.
Yeah.
But it is a bit strange as well because he left a kid as well, like a child, and it's unfair to leave a woman with a child as well, do you know? So like, you have to look at the individual case, You can't just write it off as, yeah, it's okay, it's bad. It's never going to be black and white. There's always the grey.
The little kid in Priscilla, I can't remember his name, but that actually struck me about him, his character in the movie. At one point he was playing, and I can't remember the name of the youngest guy who was the three. There was Mitzi, there was Bernadette, and then Felicia. Felicia was there, and he was with this little kid, and the kid was playing with his toys on the ground, and Felicia said something like, I suppose you know your dad won't be going out with girls, or something along those lines. And he said, yeah, no, your dad likes guys, or something like that. Yeah, is he going out with anyone at the moment? Or do you know he's going out with anyone at the moment? He said, no, I don't think so. I said, oh, you know, it was all kind of normal. And then something like his mom used to go out with a woman, but now she doesn't, or whatever. That it was all quite, he took it all in his stride. It's the same thing again, that like in and out, in terms of the fluidity of the sexuality, it didn't matter to a kid. It kind of flew in and flew out. And one thing I thought is in terms of, we haven't spoken much about the transgender side of it. And I thought Bernadette's role was very interesting because if you like, where in many movies gay relationships are portrayed as being fickle, or if you even look at, you know, soaps like Will and Grace, and that, you know, Will is like the flamboyant, you know, kind of flimsy, nothing kind of solid in terms of the relationship, whereas in that whole movie, the relationship that seemed to be shaping up in almost a traditional way was the one between Bob, I think his name was, and Bernadette, the transgender. Bernadette and I can't remember his Ralph. You know, remember the character Ralph was Bernadette. So I thought that that was quite interesting in terms of watching that storyline draw. It almost seemed to be a story of love as opposed to being, you know, the way it's normally portrayed. It seemed to be kind of a gentleness about it, which was quite refreshing.
I think it reminds me of years ago, and relatives asking me for television. It's, you know, the guy that was Declan that used to do the lotto, and then what was this, Shirley Temple? And then changed back, and then people were like, is that a boy or a girl, or was that the same person? And people were completely confused. But then it brought up loads of discussions where people were like, well, what is, like, older people saying, well, I don't know, but like, what is he a boy dressing as a girl doesn't, you know, and completely lost, and then not even trying to be judgmental in any shape or form, but genuinely just completely, And then from that, like, the older generations would think, well, you know, it's more like a drag queen, where they like, you know, they think, oh, well, it's just dressing up, but then they're like, but is that a sexuality? Is that, you know, I mean, why would, you know, that they want, and I suppose it's people's fear as well, they want the label, so they're like, well, you know, is a gay man should he dress as a woman? Is that what they're dressed as? We know they're like a guy who likes to wear women's clothes, and then people are like, no, that's something completely different. But I think it brings us back, and through that film you'll see that it's actually fear and ignorance often are the problems that people, you know, will lead to homophobic, but actually, okay, some people will be just genuinely homophobic, others are completely confused, and just through living a very sheltered life, through lack of exposure themselves or whatever, are genuinely don't understand it, so jump to conclusions and judgments. And it also struck me between both films thinking as well that maybe, you know, we're all thinking about, well, how can we change society, and how through legislation you always see that society does change, and then people's opinion change if something's legal or not legal, like being gay. But the other thing that struck me is it's also to do it exactly in a home, that for the people that I know that are gay, the ones that have had the worst time of it, that may be more depressed or suicidal, are the ones that it's not about society, it's immediately parents and siblings. So if they are like, even if they're out, but they're like, well, the mother's saying, well, like, so she's just coming for tea, so don't mention girlfriend or boyfriend, or they're like, yeah, the friend is coming, or blah blah blah, or it's like you can see the family going, anytime something comes up, that they're the people that, although they feel their family are being accepting, or the family feel they're going out of their way to be like, well, we know he's a girlfriend, or he's a boyfriend, she's a girlfriend, or whatever. But then it's like, but for our sake, you know, keep it between ourselves. Don't let cousin Mary know. Don't let such and such know. Don't let the woman down the road. Don't let your work. And then you realise that person is being made, like, that's ultimately saying, we don't accept what you are. So your family, who should unconditionally love you first and foremost,
and that's back to internalised homophobia again, isn't it? In a lot of cases, I know. We spoke earlier on about, you know, teenagers coming out of that type of thing. I mean, I'm gay too, and I just remember I would be known as a late bloomer because I was later coming out, much later, and so there are other things I would have been aware of that I mightn't have been aware of if I was a teenager. So it brings up other issues, and And I think it's back to your point again. It's you know, I think for many people, it's certainly for me, it was a case of accepting myself first of all, and then obviously people near you. You know, when I was coming out, first of all, I did a workshop for people who it was all males actually who were coming out, and there were various different ages, and there was one guy who was about 18, and he was from down the country, and I remember him saying that when he came out first, he was from a farming background, when he came out and told his family, his parents and his sister, that was his family, that they disowned him. That was the end of it. So then he went to college in the UK. In other words, he left Ireland, and that's not that long ago. So that still happens. Okay, he's from rural Ireland, so you have that kind of thing happening, but that's overt, as you were saying, overt rejection of somebody. But there is covert rejection that happens as well. Exactly your point, whereby, you know, people will say to you that they accept you as you are, but there are lots of hidden rules, like provided you don't, provided you're not visible, provided you don't do this. In other words, and we're back to the tribal thing again, which is Irish society, to many societies, but we're back to that, back to individual versus tribe again. You know, if you want to stay in tribe, you've got to play by the rules, and the rules are these. So if you want to go outside of that, either the tribe gives you a dispensation, in others they allow you, they become a little bit more flexible, or else you've got to wing it, you know, and it takes a brave person to do that. And I think for many people who are, we're talking about gay, lesbian or transgender, it takes a lot to be able to do that, and in terms of having the support to be able to do that if you're going to do it, because you want to be very strong within yourself if you don't have that support. And then we're back to the same thing again, we're back to depression, we're back to suicides and all of these type of things. And what about when we look at Mitzi's character in there? Mitzi was a guy who he was married, so he was in a marriage, so he was in the heterosexual side of things, and fathered a child, and then we see him in his gay, in a gay role. What did you make of that?
Yeah, no, it's, again, it goes back to like in Brokeback Mountain, and sometimes it's very hard to escape this heteronormative life that, you know, especially when you're growing up in patriarchal society. So, and a lot of times, like, being in this straight relationship or being in this marriage could be like nearly this learning curve, and to him realizing what he is. So it's difficult in the sense of once they're in that situation, now they don't know a way out. And that goes back to Brokeback Mountain, and it's the same in Priscilla, Queen of the Desert.
Well, I have to say, well, certainly for me, as I say, I came out later, it is much harder. It's much harder being gay than it is fitting into mainstream, much harder. And I remember being at a workshop in the UK, and the person running the workshop, you know, it was to do with nothing to do with being gay, but whatever way the program was designed, it was a psychology thing, a counselling, and I remember saying, this seems to be designed against gay people. What's the norm? The person giving the workshop was talking about a norm for heterosexual people. Then what about, does that apply to gay people as well? And I said, it seems to be anti-gay, or it doesn't seem to have an accommodation for gay people. And she said to me, he said, well, personally, she said, I can just say, I don't have anything against gay people. I have 2 children. And she said, one of them is gay. And she looked at me and she said, I can tell you that I would not change one rib of hair on her head. But she said, I can also tell you this, that she has a much tougher life than her sister. Yeah. And I thought, wow. And that is true. I think, you know, I certainly, as you say, there's a lot of prejudices, there are a lot of hurdles that you have to overcome, there's a lot of, there are times when you can be, you know, more yourself, there are times when you're a little bit more on guard, so I don't know if...
Yeah, we were actually, me and my friend were talking about this recently, and he described it really well as there's 3 points in kind of being gay, and it's like, number 1 is when you realize you're gay. Number 2 is when you you come out and you accept yourself that you are gay. And number 3 is a stage some people don't even get to at all, and it's when you realize that when you are gay and you feel like, if I could wake up tomorrow and be straight, I wouldn't be. You're that proud of being gay. And that goes back to, some people never get to that stage. And so, like, everyone knows it's harder to be openly gay, but like, again, I wouldn't choose to be straight at all. Yeah. Do you know?
I suppose, well, for me, I suppose there's that bit of a rebel in me, so it doesn't, not in that way. But I do say that rebel helps me, because there are times when I have to be extremely strong, you know, and in a way that I wouldn't necessarily have to have been when I lived in a straight life, if you know what I mean. So it's just different, seeing the two different sides of it.
Dealing with adversity makes you stronger, or else it kills you. You know,
Yes,
it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger.
At the end of the film, Mitzi and Felicia are singing. Is it ABBA? I think they're. Oh, yeah, and that's creative. You know, being up on stage and singing and all these beautiful costumes, and then at the end they say, "It's nice to be home," which I thought was a lovely way to end the film, because they've sort of found where they belong.
Yeah.
And I thought back to that again, I thought there was something very positive about that in terms of the way Bernadette stayed in terms of being with Bob. They were obviously there was something kind of that was beginning to kindle along there, and they were going to see if that worked. Well, I'm afraid we're out of time. We're going to have to leave it there. A discussion for another day, perhaps. But thank you all very much for coming.
Thank you, Tom.